Good afternoon and welcome to 3 o'clock with SOC. You caught me while I was reading a text message. The time flies every day. Folks, thanks for joining us. Give me a second while I welcome our Spanish-speaking neighbors. Buenas tardes, mi gente. Gracias por estar con nosotros hoy día en 3 p.m. con SOC. Si quieren acceso al programa en español, por favor marquen el número que aparece en la pantalla, que es 649-749-3122. Cuando le contestan su llamada, por favor compartan el clave, que es 779-328-221. Y que no se le olvide que mañana el programa va a estar en español, va a ser en español y con traducción en inglés. Folks, my name is Tammy Rivera. I'm the Executive Director and Lead Organizer for Southside Organizing Center, SOC or SOC. We're so happy that you're with us this Tuesday, July 28th. If you can believe it, that's the date we are so far in the year. We have a great program lined up for you today. But before we do that, I want to remind you, we are still here for you, folks. We're doing our very best with the digital learning curve to serve you and continue to build our relationships and organize and bring you public resources, etc. Please feel welcome and please do call us at our number 672-8090. You can email us at soc@socmilwaukee.org, and our website is there to serve you. You can get information about all that we do, and we still are updating our coronavirus information resource and ways you can take action page. So stay on that. When we have a guest here that provides more resources or information, we update the the website. We do it on Facebook as well. So please take advantage of that. I know it's a lot of information and it changes all the time. So we're doing our best to help you manage all that information and, put it in categories and make it more accessible to you. If you want to see this program or any of the forums we've held, to refer back to it or to share it with someone, we post them on Facebook. And there's an English and a Spanish dubbed over version here and then on YouTube. So please know that that's available for you. If you appreciate this forum and want it to keep going, we need to hear from you. It takes an enormous amount of our resources in all kinds of ways, but especially staff. You may not know this, but there's someone doing production and a backup, and someone doing comments, someone managing the guests, someone manning the phone and other communications lines. So it takes a lot of work, and we want to make sure that we're serving you in the best way we can. And this is the way we've decided to do it now. So if you want the forums to continue and appreciate them, please fill out the survey. Let us know what was helpful for you, what's going well, and what you want us to change. It's 3 or 4 questions. The first question is your contact information, because we need to demonstrate that we're actually serving people in our district. And then it's those things that I mentioned. What's helpful? What should we keep? What should we change? So please make sure that you cooperate with that. The other thing I want to let you know, we don't want to give a wrong impression here. So the reason I don't have a mask on right now is because I'm alone in my house. This is my fireplace room. And so all of our staff has been and continues to be working remotely, virtually. And we'll let you know if that changes, even though the city moved to phase 4 of allowing people to come in closer contact. Our office and many of our staff and many of you live in 53215 zip code, and we have a spike there. So we're not considering in-person work until we can ensure that you all are safe and that our staff is safe. So just know that the reason you don't see us with masks is we're all at home. Otherwise, when we're not, we're cooperating with masks and social distancing, etc. Before we get started with the next segment of the program, I'm going to share what I do every time, a disclaimer. The views and opinions shared here on the program don't necessarily reflect those of SOC. Why? Because we're a certain type of nonprofit organization, and we can dig into some things and other things we can't. But we do create space to have information come your way and to have hard discussions, and not always ones that we're going to agree with. All right, we are tackling in our critical update segment, we are tackling the issue of racial justice. As you all know, the George Floyd incident sparked or reignited the movement for not only law enforcement reform and stopping police brutality and abuses of power, but to address the real root of those issues, which is racial and social justice. And so we're going to tackle that. And in by no means do we think that in 5 days, in half an hour each day, that we're even going to do justice to that topic, but we want to start the discussion, bring you subject matter experts, and have a discussion with you about some of those harder topics in racial justice. And yesterday, Dr. Tony Bias gave us sort of racism, racial justice 101. He talked about the historical racism that has to do with conquering other people, colonizing other people, what is structural and systemic racism, which are the laws and rules and systems that create a racist environment and uphold a racist environment, and we still have that among us today. Today, Reggie Jackson is with us, and I'm going to bring him on in just a second. He's going to talk about internalized racism. And this is a topic I really want to talk about because I dealt with this a lot in my life. I'm Puerto Rican, and so I'll share with you when Reggie comes on what it sounded and looked like and felt like for me, and the struggles we still have. And then Thursday, we're still trying to land our guest. Jesus Salas was going to be with us, legacy worker rights leader, but his schedule got so booked, he's going to have to come back another day. And then Friday, we have Dr. Rob Smith with us, and he's going to be talking with us about a reconciliation model. What would this look like if we had healing and came out the other side in a process? And he's going to do that because he's examining the reconciliation process that South Africa used, and he's doing a research study. So that's going to be fascinating to talk about that. A couple other things before we bring our guest on. Tomorrow is the first 2020 meeting of the Collaborative Community Commission now. So if you remember, it was committee before, but it's commission. We're going to get orientation, welcome our new guests, and elect officers. So that battle has been won successfully. It survives. It's supported by the president of the Common Council and the mayor, our alders. And so we're very excited to continue that work. And then the CCC, the FPC, the Fire Police Commission Policy and Standards Committee meets Thursday as a follow-up to the presentation and the work we did last time, talking about how are we going to co-create, meaning create together a community-oriented policing policy. That's Thursday. You'll be interested in watching that as well because, as you know, the review of Police Chief Morales was completed, and he was given 11 directives by the Fire and Police Commission, including deadlines, and one of those deadlines happens to be for the 30th at that meeting. So you'll be interested in following up what's happening with that. All right, folks, we're going to endeavor to dig into a very massive, deep-rooted topic of the week, which is racism. And today we welcome Reggie Jackson. Reggie is the head griot for the America's Black Holocaust Museum, and he's also with the company Nurturing Diversity Partners. And you have seen him here because he is a close amigo with SOC, and we so appreciate having him having him here and collaborating with us. Welcome back, Reggie.
Always great to be with you, Tammy. Good to see you again, and looking forward to the show today.
Yeah, so am I. You know, as I was leading up to this topic, a lot of memories started popping up in my own life, and I'll share that as we discuss, which I'm sure we all deal with, especially since our population is 70% Latino, and we have our own cultural identities are very mixed. And there's a lot of racism externally and internally. So, folks, this is what I want to say. The purpose of this discussion is to help us reflect on this topic, um, and to do better, not to make anybody feel bad or judge anyone. It's to help all of us be more aware, be more educated, and be more mindful, especially in these times when it appears, Reggie, we have an opportunity to move the needle forward in terms of racial justice. So we're trying to be good stewards of this, you know, time in history and present. And so let's invite folks to know we really would like you to join us in today's discussion, because I'm pretty confident you all have had experiences that you can relate. So let's start out, Reggie. Remind us again the work that you do, first of all. So in case we have new viewers, remind us of the work that you do, and then we'll dig into the topic.
Yeah, sure. So I'm co-owner and lead trainer for a consulting firm called Nurturing Diversity Partners. My business partner, Dr. Fran Kaplan, and I have been traveling around the country doing this work as Nurturing Diversity Partners for almost 3 years now. But she and I have been working together for almost 12 years. We first started working together as volunteers with America's Black Holocaust Museum. We were the group that did all of the organizing in terms of bringing the museum back after it closed in 2008. We are the people that were responsible for all of the programming that the museum did over the course of time. We are part of the small group that helped to develop the virtual museum, the online museum. And so about 3 years ago, we decided that the work we were doing, talking about race, racism, African-American history, all those things that we're doing here locally in Milwaukee, we said we're missing audiences. We're missing the audiences in the suburbs and the exurbs and the rural communities. And we made an effort to reach out to those communities. And so we travel around the state of Wisconsin to 35 different communities in the state of Wisconsin. We've done work in Michigan. We've done work in Illinois. We've done work in New Jersey. We've done work in South Carolina, North Carolina, Texas, Virginia. So we've been really, really busy, particularly as it relates to the things that are going on in recent weeks and months with the murder of George Floyd, really raising awareness of people really wanting to have a conversation about these difficult topics in a way that they haven't before. So that's kind of the space that I occupy. And also, I've been a volunteer with America's Black Holocaust Museum since back in 2002. I'm one of the griots at the museum. I'm actually probably the only griot right now until the museum is able to open again safely after, we figure out COVID. But griot is a term that we borrow from our ancestors in West Africa. Griot is a French word used in the French-speaking part of West Africa that talks about the people who are the oral historians, the keepers of the history of their community. And so very proudly having been a griot with the museum for, 18 years now.
Awesome. We're so glad that you're with us again, especially as we tackle this week. So let's talk, what is internalized racism, Reggie? Just so we're all on the same page. We don't want to make an assumption people know or don't know what those terms mean.
Yeah, it's one of those things where people define racism in different ways. But basically what internal racism is what becomes embedded in the mindset of people who are the victims of racism. It's about how you see yourself, how you're taught to see yourself, the way that you're taught to evaluate your value as a human being based on the so-called racial group that you belong to. One of the interesting things about it is people are very confused about race and ethnicity. So, people aren't aware that Hispanic/Latino is not a racial group. It's actually, as defined by the federal government, it's an ethnicity. You can be Black and Hispanic, you can be white and Hispanic, you can be Asian and Hispanic, you can be of any racial group. So people oftentimes think that Hispanic/Latino is a racial group, but it isn't. And one of the interesting things, the definitions of how we define race, the Census Bureau changes it almost every time they do a census, those definitions change, right? And as I wrote an article about a year ago about how we define race in this country. And one of the things that I did was I looked at each census the first one in 1790, to see how we put categories, the racial categories in, right? And I looked at everyone from 1790 all the way through the 2010 census. And there was only one racial category that was on all of them that was consistent, and that was white. It's been on everyone. It hasn't changed. White people have never been called anything other than white by the Census Bureau, right? But, you know, Black people have been called a little bit of everything. We were called Negro, which is actually still one of the terms used. If you look up the racial categories on the census in 2020, Negro is still one of them. People are surprised to hear that. African American, Black, Negro, they're on the census in 2020. When it comes to you know, the ethnicity part, Latino/Hispanic, the Census Bureau added those together, even though they don't mean the same thing. So people are kind of confused about that also. And Mexican, one census, Mexican was considered a racial category on the census. That was in 1920. And then they removed it after that, and it's never been placed back. So at one time, the federal government considered being Mexican to be a racial category in this country. So it's really confusing, but it's really about what America has taught us to think about ourselves. And a lot of it, we don't realize it. We internalize a lot of the negative things that we hear about ourselves. We internalize the stereotypical views that people have of us, and we think that those things are true. And in some ways, we make them true by the way that we act. And so this idea of internalized racism is something that people in our community don't like to talk about it, but we talk about it in other ways. And you know, it's interesting that you're having this topic today, because I just had a conversation with someone about this 2 weeks ago, about how we see ourselves in the Black community, and how people in the, you know, the Latino community see themselves, and all of the things that we do based on what white people have basically told us about how we should see ourselves. It's very interesting.
Let me ask you, just out of curiosity, about the census. If the race white has always existed, did they categorize ethnicities for Caucasian folks? German, Irish, Polish, ever?
Never. It's never been a category. It's always been a race category for white. There's never been an ethnic category on the census for any of those groups.
Yeah, when you consider they come from different countries, they wouldn't have been able to communicate with each other, et cetera, et cetera. It just begs the question, what's the purpose of having race on the census? And then do they articulate a purpose in that historical thread that you're talking about for even having the question of race on there?
Well, you know, when you think about the categories of race and how they've changed over the course of time, part of the reason that they've changed for other groups is basically, you know, white people have defined groups differently. And even as you said, like when different Europeans came over, they weren't considered white by other people because, you know, they call themselves Italians or German or Irish or whatever. But they were still listed as white on the census, regardless of what they called each other, regardless of what they may have seen themselves as. They were still listed as white every census. And the purpose of the racial categories, when you look back at the first census, it was to really determine what space people occupied in the country. So the categories on the census, the first census, really was a way to delineate, for instance, for Black people. On that first census, we were listed, you know, they had categories for slaves and they had categories for free people. So they had free white persons, they had free Negro persons, right? And they didn't even have a category for Native Americans at the time. And so those categories were used to determine specific things about how we define people in the country. And over the course of time, those categories have been really important in determining how we allocate resources. So for instance, you know, when we talk about programs like affirmative action programs and things of that nature, those racial categories are used to determine which groups are eligible for programs of that nature. So it still plays a really important role. In addition to that, I think the thing that's also important is how we define what white is, right? So when we think about this, Tammy, if you come over here from Syria, you may not look like a white person, but the census is going to say you're a white person, right? If you come over here from Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq or any of those places in the Middle East, you may have brown skin, but you're going to be considered white because the federal government has decided if you're from that region, then you're white, right? So you don't really have a choice in determining what race you are. But you can tell a census taker that no, I'm not white, right? But then what other category can you pick? You're going to be the other, right?
You're the other.
For many years, the census takers didn't ask you what race you were. They just simply wrote down what race you were. So like for Black people, for many years, if you were, mixed race, what they call mulatto, you had one parent who was Black, one was white. And then, of course, for a long period of time, that wasn't by choice. That was Black women being raped by white men and having children. So they had categories like mulatto. They had categories like quadroon, octoroon for Blacks. These were categories. So you didn't get to tell them that, if you were whatever you wanted to be, they chose it for you. They wrote it down for you. But, in modern censuses, though, they ask you, especially if you do the one where you do the paperwork, where you fill it out and send it back in. If you do it online, you get to choose. But for many years, people didn't get to choose. And so it's interesting how people choose. Majority of Latinos in the country choose white as their racial category. And then they'll choose, Hispanic/Latino as their ethnicity. And I always find it interesting when we talk about like professional sports, like baseball, right? There are a lot of players from the Dominican Republic and Venezuela and other places like that. They're always described as Hispanic players, right? These brothers are darker skinned than I am, but nobody ever calls them Black, right? So it's like this thing where, okay, they're Hispanic/Latino, but they're really Black. Because if David Ortiz was David Johnson, nobody would call him Hispanic. They say, oh, that's a brother, that's a Black man, right? So I think it's a way of in some cases dividing people and preventing people of Hispanic origin, particularly from associating with any race at all. No, we're Hispanic. I don't have a race, right? And so that's something that I've heard quite a bit within conversations I've had with people in the Latino community that, I don't have a race. I'm Hispanic. No, you have a race. Which one is it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because it's my understanding that Latinos/Hispanic, called by the government name, was told that they were white by race. And so there has to be a political reason for them wanting to be counted as a majority in number. We ain't got time to tackle that one today.
Yeah, but I think part of it though is what if you count them as white by race, that increases the white population in the country.
Exactly.
It's a lot more white people. When you look at the census now, if you would look up the census of Milwaukee and you would look it up based on just race alone, then the white population is way higher than what it really is because they don't differentiate the non-Hispanic whites from everybody else. So they include the Hispanic whites. So it looks like there's a lot more white people in Milwaukee than there really are. But when you scroll down a list at the Census Bureau's website, you can see it broken down by ethnicity, and you see that the white population is way smaller than what people think it is.
Yeah, there's politics and everything, people. So rest assured that there are reasons why the census categorizes people. And part of it is to keep control for the majority, whatever the majority number is. And also, as Reggie mentioned, to divide. Let's say hellos, and I see there's questions, so I'm waiting. I have a lot to say, but I want to get your questions in first. Okay. Hola, Maria. Hola, Diana. Hola, Marianne. Hola, Trine. Liz. Is it safe to say that those that have internalized racism can act and oppress other minorities, or is it just a mindset? What do you think, Reggie?
Oh, no, they absolutely do oppress other minorities. They oppress their own group as well. There are a lot of people who they see themselves differently than other people of their group, but particularly if people are doing well financially. They have this tendency to look on people who aren't doing well financially and say that they're not representing their race very well. They're not pulling themselves up by the bootstraps like I have. You hear this a lot when you have people who have had financial success. And what you also find is that, there's a racial categories, right? But there's a racial hierarchy too, right? And white people are always at the top of that list. And the way it used to be for many years is that not all white people were at the top of that list. You had white people who were from Northern and Western Europe who were considered to be the best white people. And then those from other places, particularly like the southern part of Europe and the eastern part of Europe, most people in America didn't learn this in school, that in 1924, they put a law in place, an immigration law that pretty much put a huge limit, almost a ban on people from Southern and Eastern Europe from coming to the country. They were literally keeping white people out of the country because they didn't consider certain white people to be, good enough. So when you look at it here in America, based on which racial category you belong to, people consider, they use this term model minority for the Asians, right? And so they're the closest things to white that anybody can be. And of course, at the bottom of that list will always be Blacks. Latinos are a little bit higher on that list, but there's this hierarchy in the minds of people, and that allows people to look down on other, and I don't use the term minority groups because to me it's nonsense. White people are the true minority. They're only 11% of the planet Earth. So you can't tell me I'm a minority when you are, 11% of the people on the whole planet. I refuse to use that word because the word minority is a math term, right? That means you're lesser numbers. But in the way we use the word minority, it means lesser person, right? So when people say, like California, for instance, a majority of the residents of California are non-white, right? So instead of people saying that the white people in California are a minority, what do they say? They say, oh, California is a majority minority state. What the heck does that mean? That means that white people don't want to be called a minority because they know that term means more than just a math meaning. They know that means somehow you're lesser. And so people who are members of these other racial groups have a tendency of looking down at people in other groups. And it's this whole divide and conquer thing where, white people have had a consistent effort telling one group that they're better than the other group so that they can get that group to do what they want them to do. And so there's a lot of that across groups, but there's a lot of that within communities, within the Black community. And I know this within the Latino community too. The color of your skin, if you're darker skin, then, something is wrong with you. If you're lighter skin, you're closer to white, then you're considered to be a better person. You're a prettier person, whatever it may be. So that internalized racism is part of that, how we evaluate how we look based on the tone of our skin.
And also, Liz, we need to look at it in terms of just historical power, right? And so people of color have had to decide ever since they've been conquered, stolen, colonized, are they going to cooperate with the oppressors either to be safer, like self-preservation, or out of greed, out of opportunity? And so we've had to face that. If you think of for Latinos, the conquistadores, you have to have people cooperate in order to be oppressed. And so if you want to give people the benefit of the doubt, they were trying to survive, be alive. And the closer you conform, the closer you look, the safer you are. Or there are people who are greedy and saw opportunity to oppress other people. I was reminded, so I grew up, I always say, in the shadow of what was the Allen Bradley plaque, right? Which is now Rockwell. Third Street, on my 3rd Street, folks. When we arrived, the community I grew up with is mostly Polish, which were not one of the appreciated white cultures at the time. Polish with some Irish. When Mexicans got there, they were playing like tag. You're the unloved people now. When Puerto Ricans got there, Mexicans did it to us. I remember that, folks. If not got a Mexican family, that Puerto Ricans did it to the Cubans who arrived after us, and the Cubans did it to the Hmong after it. So part of it is this fear of if you're the person being attacked, then I'm safer, and then people do it out of greed too. Okay, Stephanie. I'm interested in finding out what was happening in the USA in 1920 for Mexicans to be listed as a race. So what was politically happening with the US and Mexico in 1920?
Well, a big part of it was that there was a really pretty good relationship between the Mexican government and the United States government, primarily because of the need for Mexican laborers coming to the United States. There were a huge number, millions of Mexicans that were allowed to come to the United States as laborers, working on farms and other places. And so, because of such a large number of them here, it was pretty common for Mexicans to be in the country. And so they added that category, but then they took it away in the 1930 census, because what happened was that 1924 immigration law, which is the strictest in U.S. History, it changed the dynamics and the conversations about race change. One of the elements of that was this idea called eugenics, which is, kind of infamous way of looking at human beings and saying that some people are more valuable than others, and that people who are so-called well-born should breed with other well-born people, and those who aren't well-born should not be allowed to have children. So they started to sterilize lots and lots of mostly women. They sterilized some men too, but they sterilized lots of people. And so the conversations in the 1920s began to be this idea of 100% Americanism was this theme, right? And what it was about white people's fear of not having this huge majority of the population continue to be white, because you had such a large number of immigrants that had come here from other places, including places like Mexico. And so because of the fear that occurred, and because of the rhetoric around 100% Americanism, they changed that in 1930. And they said, we're not going to value Mexicans.
Validate. We're not going to validate Mexicans,
to call them a racial group anymore. And then, of course, we began to see huge deportations of Mexicans beginning after that law was passed, and continuing in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, which most people don't know. We talk about the deportations that are happening now. America's been deporting people of Latino origin for many, many decades. It's nothing new.
No. So right, Stephanie, what you see is we need Mexicans in 1920, so we're going to validate them.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're afraid of Mexicans in 1930. We're going to invalidate them,
mm-hmm.
etc. Or for whatever reason, that Mexicans being attacked, just like they're being attacked now. Really, the immigration issue has a lot to do with the Mexican-U.S. issue. And Stephanie says, control, exactly. Marlene says, thank you for addressing the Middle Eastern population as well. Marlene is a recent staffer with us. She's killing it as a forum coordinator and our coronavirus coordinator. And she was sharing with me that Palestinians are considered white race, right? Mm-hmm. And when you think of, what you were sharing, and people self-identifying as race, I don't know if they would consider themselves that. But that's the only option they have,
right?
Unless they say other. And so I wanted to share a little personal testimony. It's only God's grace. I don't know. The Lord done deposited things in me. I don't know where they came from. But I remember as a teenager refusing to say that I was of white race. And at that time, the government, self-determined for us that we were that. I said, absolutely not. We're three races, in my opinion. I'm Puerto Rican and most Latinos, so I'm Black. I have African roots, and I'm European because I have Spanish roots, and I have indigenous Taino roots. So I consider myself three races. And so since teenager on, whenever I was given that question, I've always said other. I'm multiracial. But a lot of that was prescribed to us in applications for assistance, all kinds of things. It was just God's grace. I have no idea where that came from. Mm-hmm. And so, folks, you get to determine your identity. It's not prescribed to you. And so, for Latinos, I would ask you the question, what your race is, and examine that. And if you want some more clarification, maybe, do one of them DNA tests.
One of the other things, Tammy, that's really important part of how people were determining their racial group. So another thing, back in the 1920s, the early 1900s, race, being a white person was really critically important, because there were restrictions on people in terms of their ability to own land and other property unless they were citizens of the United States, right? So the first citizenship law in the United States to determine, who could be a citizen, basically defined citizenship. The only people who were eligible to be citizens were white people, right? So that meant that if you were Asian, you couldn't be a citizen, which meant if you lived in California, you were Chinese, you couldn't own property, you couldn't own land, right? So people fighting fighting to become white. And there were, multiple really famous Supreme Court cases where people from Japan. There's one case. So this is how the Supreme Court has played games, right? One particular case, they determined that people from Japan are actually white because they look white, right? And then there was a case shortly after that that said, well, okay, they are Caucasian, they are white, but they're not really white by the definition of white. So they're really not white. So, it was always one of these things where people were fighting to be white. And people from India, the nation of India, were fighting to be categorized as Caucasian. And there was a famous case where this guy from India who basically said, listen, the Indian people are basically who Caucasians are. We're descended from Caucasians, right? And so the Supreme Court said, oh yeah, you're right. You are white then. You are a Caucasian, but guess what? You're Caucasian, but you're not white. So there's been, these really weird ways that the power dynamics of being white played out. And a lot of it had to do with the rights that you had. Native Americans didn't become citizens of the United States until 1924, unless they married a white person. Asian Americans didn't gain citizenship rights until the 1940s. So people have been fighting for citizenship rights because it was so restricted. Black people got citizenship rights in the 1870s or 1868, I think it was. So, people have been fighting to be citizens because there are certain rights that you accrue as a citizen. And many people have fought to be white because, that was a category where the only people who were citizens could be white for a very long period of time.
Yeah. So folks, you see, like, it had to do with living too. Some people made the choice for survival, for safety, and other people for opportunity. And we see a lot of that going on today, right? Like we have a lot. Let's see what Carlos say. Carlos Schmidt, although most Central Americans are mixed with Native American blood here in the States, when the U.S. government put these Central American immigrants in cages and call them illegal, they never acknowledge that these illegals are the original people on this land. Through all the history of the ancestors, really walked all the Americas. We hear you, Carlos. Malaya, Barty Singh, Third Supreme Court. Bhagat Singh. I'm not sure, Malaya, what you're sharing. Maybe that's a case.
That's the case of the Indian guy who was fighting, right? Bhagat Singh. That's his name.
Bhagat Singh. All right. Thank you, Malaya. Listen, let's talk, folks, some of our personal experience. You may feel a little vulnerable, but let's be real. It's still happening today. Let me tell you, my father is a Black Puerto Rican, dark skin, Afro. My mother was a white Puerto Rican, red hair, skin that didn't tan. And so there's 3 siblings. My older brother presents more of African history. I'm in the middle, and my younger brother presents more white. We got all the 3 shades in us 3 siblings. But I want to tell you, I don't remember at all devaluing my brother who appeared as African, more African descent or Black. But we for some reason had some concerns about being white and not wanting to be white. And folks, I want to make a confession. We painted my younger brother with shoe polish one day because we thought there was a problem with him being too white. And so somewhere in our history, we have that, an appreciation of Black, right? And maybe that had to do with the love my mother had for my father or whatever. But I'm in the middle. So I specifically, and I want to hear from you all if you've had this experience, especially Latino. I cannot begin to tell you the pain that I suffered at my mother's hands straightening my hair. Okay, this is my natural hair with products. It gets a lot bigger and a lot frizzier, but it has product in it. But I kid you not, it was a constant issue in my life for my mom to do my hair. Also, that I had a round, wide nose, that I had big lips. Like I could not, it was taboo kind of for me to wear bright lipstick because I had really full lips. Now, my mother was super, super overprotective. So I don't know if that was about not wanting to have boys look at me or if I had full lips. But come on now, I want to hear from you all some of the experience. That's right. Pelo malo, bad hair, is what I heard all my life. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, I'm rebellious by nature because God made me to fight social justice. So innately, I was always kicking back. So what do? Oh, no, the biggest hair I can wear, the curly, you know what I mean? So, folks, why don't you share some of your experience? And we can talk about some of these things. Marrying better, like
Mhm.
uplifting the race meant lighter skinned,
Mhm.
the hair, the nose, the curves on women, um, you know, on it, the color of your eyes. We have cousins that are blonde, blue haired, and cousins that are dark skinned, dark eyed, uh, afro and wear afros. So, folks, why don't we ask for some questions and comments around that? Let's
Yeah.
list
Do
let's
you
list some
remember? You remember
internalized
in the
racism.
1990s when people were losing their minds over color contact lenses? Everybody had
Yeah.
to have pretty eyes. You remember that? I saw that when I first moved back to Milwaukee from California. It's like
Mm.
I'm running it. I was at a club in California actually. I saw one of the darkest skinned brothers I've ever seen in my life. This brother had the bluest of blue eyes you could imagine. Looked like I was looking in the Pacific Ocean, looking in his eyes, right? And I knew that those weren't his regular eyes, right? So that's part of this whole idea of internalized racism. We think we have to have characteristics like white people. We have to have, so-called good hair, right? And so what do we do? We go and we put products in our hair to make our hair straight. And I'm not mad at women for doing whatever they think makes them look more attractive or whatever they're comfortable with. But I was asked a number of years ago to do a talk about Madam C.J. Walker, and I refused to do it because I'm not a fan of Madam C.J. Walker. Okay, it's great that she was a first self-made female millionaire in the country, but she did it by telling Black people that there was something wrong with them. She not only developed a straightening comb to straighten those so-called naps out of your hair, but she also sold skin bleaching cream. And I find it very interesting for those who may know who Sammy Sosa is. The famous baseball player. When he was slamming Sammy with the Cubs, he was still, about my complexion. Now he looks about as white as these things I have behind me because he has been using skin bleaching cream. And that's a big part of what people do. They try to look as white as possible. And I find it very interesting that those conversations that we have in the Black community about good hair and bad hair, that they happen in your community as well.
They do. I mean, they had all my life. They still do. Sometimes we get debates in families. I remember describing my father as Black, and one of my aunts saying, "Your dad wasn't Black." I said, "What you mean my dad wasn't Black? And what color you think he was?" And then she says, "But Puerto Ricans are not Black." And then my aunt, she straightens her hair recently. She stopped, and then I was like, "Titi, auntie, you got the nappiest hair of all of us. Like, I don't understand why you don't embrace that." And so the idea of I can't be Black, again, the roots of those survival, opportunity, or greed, like those are the things that people, associate with that, but it manifests itself. Let's list some other ways that internalized racism manifests itself for our people to recognize it. So we already identified physical things like you don't want to have curly or frizzy hair, you don't want to accentuate your lips, you need a nose job because your nose is round or wide, or what are some of the other ways it presents itself? You got to marry up, which means marry white or
Yeah.
lighter.
Yeah. A lot of Asians have actually had eyelid surgery their eyes are different. And so there was a craze going on in China for years where people were having eyelid surgery because they wanted to have eyes like white people. And so that's still going on to this day in Japan and China, a lot of young people in particular. But some of the other parts of it as well, Tammy, are really about our names. Think about this. I'm sure you know some Hispanic folks that have changed their name, right? I have a colleague that I work with down in Texas, and she married a German guy, right? So her married name was Thorne. When she got a divorce, she went back to her original Latino name, right? But she realized she couldn't get any business. She lost a bunch of business. She had to change back to her married name, which isn't her married name because she divorced the man, but she uses that married name and business picked up again right away. So that's another piece of it. People changing their names to try
because of locked out of opportunity. Marlene says, I went to an all-white Catholic middle school and all the girls had blonde hair and blue eyes. So I straightened my big curls. She has beautiful curls, by the way, and got blue contacts to make myself look more like them. They even would say, Marlene, you should straighten your hair and you would look way prettier. Even in the Middle Eastern culture, women that are lighter skinned, have colored eyes, are looked at as super beautiful. Many Arab Americans will not let their daughters marry darker skinned men because of that idea. Lots of pressure.
Wow. Yeah, that's truly tragic because, you know, what I find, and I think I told you about this scene in the movie that Paul Rodriguez was in, where he was running for common council in LA and he was running against a black woman. And there was an older white guy that had held a seat for, I don't know, 20, 30 years. He wanted to handpick his successor. And so there was a scene in the movie where they were at this big park and they were having kind of a festival to celebrate Mexican heritage, right? And so this white guy was out there and he put on the sombrero and the traditional Mexican clothing and was dancing to the Mexican music. And then Paul Rodriguez looked at him and turned to the black woman. He said, you know what? They love everything about us except us. So there's this idea of cultural appropriation where, you know, you're seeing white people walking around with dreadlocks, you know, braiding their hair the way that black and Latino people have braided their hair.
Lip injections.
You know, and even think about this, Tammy. How many people are getting butt implants so that they can have a thicker rear end that is more traditionally thought of as being black or Latino rear end? Things of that nature, people getting collagen injected in their lips to have thicker lips. You know, there's so many things that we talk about internalized racism with us, but there's a segment of white society that doesn't feel comfortable being white anymore. So we're trying to become more white and they're trying to become less white. And it's really just an interesting interplay back and forth.
Because when you feel like you have no fears and you're in power, you can do whatever you want. And what do you aspire to, right? Without giving up your power. Malaya, yes, there's definitely that desire for whiteness in the Asian community, Asian AM community. I know growing up, lighter skin was associated with more positive narratives versus darker skin. Colorism is another way racism shows up. So it's interesting too that I believe, like from my own personal experience, like I shared my mom and my dad, and in Puerto Rican, about the colorism. For instance, I don't have any recollections of any negative connotation with my father's beauty as a black man, because he was a very handsome man. But like there was never he was not attractive because of he was darker. As a matter of fact, like that was a value that I remember my mom sharing, and people like, oh, he's so handsome, he's so dark. And okay, but that doesn't translate to the women in Puerto Rico. So a dark woman in Puerto Rico is not considered, in my experience, before all my family beats up on me, my friends, I remember like, oh, like, you know, a different narrative and value ascribed to females who are dark versus men who were dark in Puerto Rico. And I think that's why it showed up in my family, because black was beautiful for a male in my family. And so hence my poor younger brother, who was not black, you know, got painted because it was like, oh, he's not beautiful. Right. But so colorism is still the other thing that's interesting about our community, our Latino, our ex community, is there are other layers. So your immigration status becomes an issue of also value or devaluing. So I have heard, as I said, I have a blended family. I'm divorced now, but I have a blended Mexican family. And I've heard folks mention, oh, they're immigrants, even though they're talking about other Mexicans. And so that becomes a place of power and also touch your it so I don't get the attention or devaluing. The other layer for Latino, so these are compounded issues for Latino. And I looked at some of this when I was doing my studies for my doctorate, even though I haven't finished. Anybody can help me out there, get back in UWM because they kicked me out of my program. Give me a hand. But I'm trying to fight back in. But anyway, what I found is we have a compounded issue. On top of the issue of the race, then it's immigration status. It's also language.
Mm-hmm.
So as we can see, there's a backlash about people speaking their languages of origin. But also there's research that shows if people have accents and what type of accents are considered valuable, which is no mystery, folks. English accent is on the top of the list of valuable accents. Mm-hmm. And so Latino, Spanish accents are not at the top of the list. So language, and then third, our indigenous status. So if you look more like the indigenous people in many of our cultures, that's not a place of value, right? In Puerto Rico, people use the word jíbaro. Sometimes it's a negative connotation, and sometimes it's a positive. I've heard Mexicans say, oh, ellos son indios, and it's almost always used as negative. So now on top of the color, there's all these other ways to say you're less valuable. Gets very complicated.
And it's the exact opposite in the Black community. If every Black person who claimed they got some Indian blood in their ancestry actually had Indian blood, it would have been a whole lot more Indians around, right?
Interesting, so, yeah.
We know that our great grandmothers and whoever was being raped by white men and having these light-skinned children years later, and I hear this from multiple people's families. Oh yeah, we got Indian blood, but then they do the 23andMe, and they're like, I ain't got no Indian blood. I got some Irish blood. Or I got some German blood, but ain't no Indian showing nowhere in my DNA, right? So there's been this thing in the Black community where we'll say that we have, some Indian blood because somehow that separates us and makes us more beautiful. We have this texture of hair because, oh yeah, my great-grandmother was Indian. No, she wasn't. Your great-great-grandfather was Irish. That's why you have that hair, right?
Yeah, I wonder if that's a reaction to the trauma of having to acknowledge that your ancestors were raped, and it's more palatable and more, you'd rather know your ancestors were in relationship with a Native American willingly than be raped.
Yeah.
That it's a trauma and a survival. Yeah. I'm not sure. I haven't studied that, but I was always curious about that. Okay. Yes, folks, I always go over the time when we're talking about our critical topic. Reggie, let's leave folks with somewhere to go with this. Do you have any suggestions for how people can further sort of examine their own, biases or internal racism, and how they can help others who they love or care about?
I think a big part of it is really learning the history of the group that you belong to. There's some phenomenal historians that have written like really great books about the history of Latinos in the United States, the history of Asian Americans in the United States. If we're able to get in touch with our history, the history of the group that we belong to, you can have more pride in the group that you belong to. What I can do, Tammy, is I'll send you a list of a variety of books that I've used, because one of the things that really helped me when I was in college at UWM was I took a Native American history class, and I really didn't know much at all about Native Americans other than what I saw in the cowboys and Indian shows when I was a little boy. But I learned so much about, the diversity of lived experiences for Native Americans. And I decided at that time that I wanted to know more about the history of other groups of people of color. So I read, books on the history of Asian Americans, all the different Asian American groups. So whether it be Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Hmong, whatever it may be. I also looked into the history of Latinos in the United States and how varied that history is. We lump all the Latinos together, right? Whether you're from Peru or Chile or, the Dominican Republic, wherever. And we make this assumption that they're all the same, but they're all of these different histories. I'll send you a list of what I consider to be the best books that really helped me to understand it. Because I think when we learn that history, because that's something that nobody teaches us in school, right? Nobody ever talks to us about that history. But when we're able to get in touch with that history, it really helps us to
the pride
build some of that myth that we have. And there's also a series of books that was written by this Black historian years ago on race, which I think really is very eye-opening. And the other thing, just recently, because of DNA, advances in DNA, I think anybody who really wants to know who they are should take one of these current kind of DNA tests, because you'll find out that you're not who you think you are, right? I think a lot of people look in the mirror and they think they know who they are, but when you take that DNA test and you discover the diversity of who you are as a human being, that really kind of changes who you are.
breaks that all those walls and systems.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what we mean about structure and system, folks. The fact that we didn't learn about our history is a structural, systematic way of continuing and deepening racism. Reggie, thank you so much for your time, folks. I know we just touched the surface, but let's keep the discussion going. Be safe, brother. Look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tammy. Take care.
Folks, I'm going to have to make up time real fast here. So let me make some quick announcements and move forward. Marlene, you can come on just for a quick second to make those 2 announcements of what's starting now. It doesn't have to be elaborate. Let's just go ahead, maybe take a minute to do that.
Yeah, hi. So the MCTS bus system is now going to require masks starting August 1st. So everyone taking the transportation through bus, you need to have a mask. And then Wisconsin is now on Chicago's airport quarantine list, which means our numbers are really high at this moment. And if you are, so individuals traveling through Wisconsin on their way to Chicago from a state not on the list, they do not need to quarantine if they were in Wisconsin for less than 24 hours. But individuals who travel to Wisconsin, even if for less than 24 hours, still need to quarantine upon returning to Chicago unless they are essential workers. So if you live in Wisconsin, you're an essential worker and you're traveling to Chicago, you're fine. But if you do go to Chicago and you are there and you're coming in from Wisconsin, just be careful because you might have to quarantine, and it's currently not recommended to be traveling to Chicago at this moment.
Thank you, Marlene, for that update. So you heard it here, folks. If you want more information about that travel order, we put the link there on the comments for you. I'm gonna bring on Gabe real quick, and she's gonna make some announcements we need to hear and share a video.
Hi, everybody. I just want to remind you all that in-person absentee or early voting starts today. So you can go to the Zeidler Municipal Building or Manitoba School or Midtown Center starting today until August 9th. And that'll be 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday on weekdays, and then 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. on Saturday and Sunday. And then there are more limited locations as well. The South Side locations are the libraries, Bayview, Tippecanoe, and Zablocki, and Mitchell Street. And that is Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays only from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. So just keep that in mind. And then I will leave you all with the census video, and the conversation that was had about the census was really interesting. And it's just another reason for us all to be doing the self-response online, by phone, or by mail, so that we can be defining ourselves and not have someone from the Census Bureau knocking on our door that may try to define for us what we are, what our race is, what our ethnicity is. So just another reason to be doing that census and filling it out. So thank you for that conversation, and I'll leave you with the video.
Aloha. 2020 is a very important year for our Pacific people. Now is the time to participate in the census.
It will only take you a few minutes to complete the form.
It's safe and confidential.
It guides where public funding goes for things like
hospitals for our people, schools for our children,
fire stations for our communities.
So whether it's your baby's first census
or your 8th census,
it all adds up and helps to shape our future.
Shape our future. Start here. Complete the census at 2020census.gov.
All right, folks, I want to remind you we're going to continue our discussion tomorrow with Dr. Baez, an all Spanish program Wednesday. Those of you who speak English are going to be able to access the forum and get simultaneous interpretation via the teleconference to participate. And then we want to share solidarity with protesters, and we want to remind you that our thoughts and prayers are with you all who have been impacted so greatly by the coronavirus, especially those of you who have tested positive or have a family member, those who have lost ones. Thank you for being with us. Please fill out the survey. The link is in our comments, and we'll leave you with our thank you for our funding partners.
Hi, I'm Marisol Diaz, Communications Manager at SOC. We would like to thank everyone for supporting our 3 o'clock with SOC live show and for completing our SOC survey. In addition to thanking our residents for tuning in and sharing our show, we would also like to thank the following sponsors: Wisconsin Voices, Community Development Block Grants, Neo Philanthropy State Infrastructure Fund, Movement Voter Project, Catholic Campaign for Human Development, Zilber Foundation, City of Milwaukee Office of Violence Prevention, Tides Foundation, Employ Milwaukee, and all of the faithful individuals who support SOC through their personal donations. Thank you.